Our topic today is Log4j 1 week in. My name is Bervar. I work as a group security architect at Conscia Group. I have about 25 years of experience in information security, and in Conscia Group, I take care of group security architecture, obviously, and I'm also the, I will say, the service owner of the cyber defense service, which is our SOC/MDR service, Managed Detection and Response service. So today's topic is about obviously about the vulnerability which has been in the news for the last week or more, and the purpose of today's call is to actually have an update on that, to see if what we have been doing so far is correct and what are the things we should be doing. This webinar is brought to you by Conscia Group. We are a pan-European company present in 6 different countries. And at the end of the presentation, you will also get contacts in each local country where you can contact the security experts if you need any kind of help with a resolution or consulting regarding this issue. So the purpose of this meeting, as I said, is to somehow review what has been going on around Log4j in the past week or so. Any kind of new findings that we might actually want to know about this, because I think everybody was having a very hectic week with a lot of knee-jerk reactions, and we need to systematically look at what has been happening and whether your countermeasures so far have been effective, so you can change them if necessary. The purpose, of course, is also to somehow suggest what better countermeasures are possible now that we know more details, and perhaps to be aware that certain areas of countermeasures are perhaps not as effective as others, and to discuss which particular countermeasures or controls can be most scalable or most effective when handling this vulnerability. And of course, after about a week or so, we can also look at the long-term, or better, long tail, because this will be a very long tail vulnerability. It will impact us, as you know, for quite a while to come, because we are unlikely to address all the instances of this vulnerability in our environments if our environments are complex enough. Lastly, we will talk about future panic. So for me, security is about having sound sleep, not about racing the attackers. So we will see what techniques are possible. So the next time a Log4j-like vulnerability appears, you will not panic, right? You will have basically defenses already in place, and you will be able to either sleep soundly or have a much more relaxed tempo in fixing this vulnerability. So very quickly, let's just recap what happened in the beginning of December. So Log4j is a Java software package which had a vulnerability which was exploited via system logging, as the Log4j package or library is the logging subsystem which a lot of Java applications include. Why was it vulnerable? Because it had unchecked input, so it was an injection or a code injection vulnerability, a very simple one, a very trivial one, like a textbook vulnerability where attacker could supply more or less executable code and influence Log4j to basically execute any kind of code on the local system via some kind of process which we'll go through in detail. And this was done over the network. So it was an unauthenticated vulnerability, which means you don't need to log in to the target system, to the vulnerable system. You can actually do it anonymously. And you have to open a network session to the vulnerable system, and there must be another session from that vulnerable system to an attacker-controlled server from which we actually download the executable code to compromise the affected system. So that's, in a nutshell, the idea behind the vulnerability. The timeline, on December 9th, the proof of concept exploit was published, but the vulnerability was seen exploited as early as December 1st, perhaps even earlier. And our SOC, so the Conscia Cyber Defense SOC, has seen mass exploitation starting on the very day of the proof of concept publishing. So on December 9th, this was last Friday, we have seen an exponential increase in exploitation. So this is being extremely heavily exploited on the internet. Nobody will get away with it by being a non-interesting target. So the impact of this vulnerability is that if you're vulnerable, the system which is vulnerable will allow the attacker to execute arbitrary code in the context of the application. In the context of the application, this typically means it's not privileged, hopefully. So it's under the username or the identity under which the application is running, and this allows unrestricted code execution, which can lead to access to sensitive data, exfiltration, lateration to other systems, persistent, and so on. It is not a system vulnerability. It doesn't give you root access. This is important, but it can give you initial access to the system, which can lead to some local privilege escalation, which is very likely because a lot of people don't patch a lot of local privilege escalation vulnerabilities. So it can be the first step in the chain of attack, which completely compromises the affected system. And it was labeled as critical because it's a remote code execution. It's so widespread in code. It's quite hard to patch or to find even, and it's really easy to exploit. But more importantly, what is the impact we have observed so far in terms of real damage? We have seen attackers performing coin mining, which is not that critical, right? We have seen affected systems, compromised systems being used as a DDoS source. More worryingly, the Conti ransomware gang from Russia has weaponized this in an exploit kit targeting vCenter and ESXi. So VMware environments are being kind of targeted with a automated exploit kit. So this is one I think very worrying development. So one of the primary targets is your VMware environments, which are vulnerable. And the commercial providers of exploit kits are including this in their ransomware kits. So obviously the criminal community is seeing this as a very, very important step in exploitation. So this will get exploited a lot and is getting exploited a lot already. Very quickly, graphically, right? We said the vulnerability is about the attacker sending a piece of data to the victim, and this data is logged by the victim using the Log4j library, which induces the vulnerability, which causes a session to be made back to the attacker-controlled host, typically via LDAP. 85% today is via LDAP. Download the malicious code and compromise the victim. So the entire session is about supplying a particular tainted data, which contains instructions on how to contact the attacker server, and then the victim downloading this data from the attacker server. So why is this here? Because we obviously have a couple of different areas in which we can prevent this. We can try to prevent this in the initial sending of the exploitation code. We can try to prevent it on the victim as it executes it, and we can try to prevent the back session to the attacker to download the malicious code. So we have at least three different areas of three different battlefields in which we can combat this vulnerability. And this was done by the initial countermeasures. So initially, when this vulnerability came out, those were, I would say, the 5 countermeasures proposed. And let's see how if they're of high enough quality. So I typically look at countermeasures with regard to complexity of deployment and assurance. Assurance meaning how well does the control prevent or detect the particular vulnerability. So the 5 different aspects of, or 5 different suggestions were, first of all, patch Log4j, right? Obviously, or reconfigure it. You could also reconfigure the library to disable the vulnerable path in code. Obviously, this is a prevention mechanism. This completely prevents the vulnerability from happening. But the big problem is, of course, finding where this vulnerability is present on our system. So the inventory of the vulnerability is tricky, and the availability of the patch is tricky. We will see later on that we are far from being well patched, or the vendors are far from being well patched in their own products. So patching is obviously the holy grail of how we have to do this, but the problem is, of course, how to find what is to be patched and how to find the patches if the vendor has not yet providing the patches themselves. The second application-focused method was to look at application logs to see where requests which are obviously tainted are coming in. So that's a kind of a detection response mechanism. With this, you could do some forensics and determine that you were compromised or not. Of course, the problem here is distribution of logs. You had to look at the logs of every single application. Not a lot of people are centralizing all their Java applications logging. And also it is likely, if you distribute that perhaps even the log has been modified or erased. So it's a high complexity mechanism. It can provide you with higher assurance if you centralize all logging, but I'm sure that 95% of us are not centralizing all Java application logging unless you do this for operational qualities, which is very useful. So those were the 2 application-focused methods. One is prevention-focused, so patching the application, obviously, and one is detection focused, looking at the application logs. Then we had 3 ideas on how to do prevention or detection on the network. One was to provide ingress filters, so filtering of incoming data to vulnerable endpoints. For example, with IPS, web application firewall, next generation firewall, and so on. The idea was, of course, to catch the offending string or the offending request, which contains the instructions on how to make that secondary session. That is kind of very cheap because it comes with most of the IPS and WAF products. Most of the vendors put out a signature. The problem is attackers can very easily mutate or substitute things in that particular request to make it evade network detection. So that is definitely not a very, very strong, high assurance method of doing that. And of course, typically you will need SSL or TLS decryption to catch that. The second idea was to do egress filters to make sure that the secondary session doesn't come to go out to the attacker's server. So egress filtering from the potential victim to the attacker server was suggested as a way to block the secondary session, the one which is used to download the actual exploit code or the actual executable code to the vulnerable server. And most recommendations said, well, the attackers are typically using LDAP, DNS, CORBA, RMI, and HTTP to download that code. So if you block those ports or protocols, you should be okay. And of course, this is also not a very high assurance method because attackers can mutate those. They can run LDAP, DNS, and so on different ports very easily with a 3-second modification to the script. And they can do this over TLS. So your fancy application recognizing firewalls will not be able to recognize those protocols unless you're doing TLS decryption for all outbound protocols, which I'm sure that almost nobody is doing. So egress filtering, the attackers can again very easily defeat that. It is true that the stupid attackers won't, right? But most of the attackers can very easily mutate their attacks to also defeat egress filters if there are blacklisting. So if they're filtering on specific ports, if they're filtering on specific IP addresses. And the last countermeasure which was proposed was analyze your network logs to see those sessions like LDAP sessions and so on to see if they're going outside of your network. Again, if you're not doing very strict egress filtering, this was more or less impossible because you had to analyze millions or tens of millions of suspicious events. So this kind of this collection of initial countermeasures, if we look at them, only the patching suggestion is something which is really high assurance, and perhaps application logs if you are doing a lot of central collection, but most of the network stuff is not really useful. So the initial set was more of a kind of knee-jerk reaction of what you can quickly do to at least get rid of the the stupid or the very simple attackers, but we need to do better, right? We need to do better, especially because the patching of this vulnerability is still beyond the reach of many of us, either because we don't know where it is present or because the vendor has not yet provided a patch. So we need something which is of higher assurance and gives us another weapon to address this vulnerability. And of course, there have been some additional complications, right? There was not only one vulnerability, but there was 2 others coming up in the last week. So the initial fix, 2.15.0, did not fix the vulnerability fully. There were 2 additional vulnerabilities, 1 additional remote code execution and 1 denial of service, which also apply to Log4j. So if you patched very quickly, then your patch was likely not to cover the entire spectrum of exploitation. It is important to say that those additional 2 vulnerabilities do require non-default configuration of Log4j. So they are unlikely to be present in your environment unless you have a non-default config. What does non-default config mean? It means that you're using the context lookup plugin inside Log4j. Perhaps the vendor is using that, you don't know. But they're not likely to be exploited because, again, the window of opportunity is much narrower for the attacker. The attackers will definitely focus on the first vulnerability. So the second and the third vulnerability are definitely not as pressing as the first one, but eventually you should patch them, of course, because they depend on a configuration setting. Perhaps if you enable this setting in the future, you will be vulnerable again. The second thing is what I already discussed. Blacklist network defenses are unreliable. So if you're filtering traffic based on signatures or blacklists, attackers can, like shown in this slide here, can substitute certain things in their requests, and they can very easily bypass your WAF or IPS signatures. This is just one example. We have known about this for like 20 plus years. So it's not something new. If the language in which you are forming the exploit allows for substitutions, you can actually write the same kind of string in gazillion different ways, and IPS or WAF will not pick it up because it cannot match interpretation. And the last complication was that if you wanted to discover where your vulnerability was, the tools available were not that great. Now, about 10 days after, we have much better tools to discover that, because it is really hard to discover this vulnerability. It can be easy if you log a lot, but it can be very hard because, as you will see, with a lot of transitive trust issues, packaging of libraries into bigger Java archives and so on, it was not easy to deploy a discovery tool which would point out all the occurrences of this in your environment. Now, I want to also talk about a very important security concept, which is called transitive trust. Transitive trust means that if person A trusts person B and person B trusts person C, then it turns out that person A will trust person C, right? And this transitive trust occurs in a couple of scenarios in this particular Log4j vulnerability. First of all, if your application is relying on a certain library, that library will rely on another library, and this other library will rely on another library. So this shows you, for example, an example of how deep Log4j can be embedded in certain software packages. An analysis has shown that it can be embedded up to 9 levels or more into the dependency chain of certain applications. So that's also why it is taking so long to fix. In the Maven repository, about 8% of Java packages are fixed or have been fixed a couple of days ago. So we are at about 10% now, probably, of fixing. So this is pretty scary. We are nowhere near 80 or 90% of packages being fixed because of those dependencies. But transitive trust, I think, has a much more impact on our environments, because we tend to think that this Log4j impacts only hosts which are visible to attackers, which is definitely not true. So if you have a host which is visible to the attacker and can receive the attacker's exploitation attempt, it can get compromised. But it can also relay this data to another host, which will try to log this, and this other host will get compromised as well. So, for example, if you have a multi-tier application and the attacker will attack the exposed tier, for example, the web server, this web server might pass certain information to the inside, where they will be logged with a vulnerable Log4j application, and the inside host will actually get exploited. So it is not only a problem of exposed hosts, it is also the problem of all the hosts which kind of trust the exposed hosts. An example of this would be an e-commerce application. An example of this would be Cisco ISE, for example. So if you're using Cisco ISE, which is vulnerable, the attacker could, for example, talk to a guest portal or to some kind of application which is using in the backend Cisco ISE and submit their credentials, which are filled with the tainted data. And at the end, Cisco ISE will get, for example, compromised. The same thing will go with CM, for example. If the attacker submits something to an exposed host, that host will actually send this to a CM for logging, the CM will get exposed. So this vulnerability travels with data as it is being logged. So be aware that if you are doing a risk assessment today, do not only include the directly exposed hosts in your risk assessment, but also question yourself, what is the next level of exposure which results in data being forwarded from those hosts to typically more sensitive hosts towards the inside. The second issue with transitive trust is, for example, when we have systems which are exposed to the internet, vulnerable to something else, to some other vulnerability, but the attacker is using them to host the vulnerable code, so the exploitation code. Remember, we kind of assumed at this point that the attacker is on the internet and his code repository is also on the internet. This is very likely very soon no longer the case, because the attacker will compromise your victim system by actually posting the code on a trusted system, and then no egress network filtering will help you, because the trusted system is on the on the trusted side of your network. If you have a cloud environment, let's say if you're hosting virtual machines in Azure, AWS, and so on, one of those virtual machines can get compromised with a different exploit used as the repository to host the code. And then it's really hard for you to do egress filtering because the code repository, right? The exploit code repository is on your trusted network. So be aware that this will start happening soon. The attackers will find out that you're doing egress filtering and will start abusing other systems which might not be sensitive just to host the exploitation code, invalidating your egress filtering. And there are new ways of exploitation which were found in last week. For example, you might have a user, so a client in your environment, visiting a malicious site. That malicious site sending a web page which contains WebSockets functionality, which will cause the browser to attack an internal victim, which will then connect out to the attacker. So even clients can be subverted to attack internal systems if after they visit a malicious external site, which gives them instructions on how to submit this via WebSockets, which do not adhere to the same origin policy, SOP. And you can actually abuse your users to be relays of this vulnerability to your internal network. So things are quite complicated because of this transitive trust. So it's not only the exposed hosts, but it is also the hosts which the target hosts trust, which can actually relay this vulnerability to them. So this is quite important. So in terms of prevention, what can we do? So what are the new ways of doing that? So patching is still absolutely the best way to prevent that if you can find a good inventory of where the vulnerability is and if you have the patches available, of course. Analyzing application logs, of course, if you have centralized logs. Two things which I would like to mention additionally, which have turned out to be really efficient in the last week. The first one is EPP/EDR, so endpoint agents which are able to observe how applications behave and block or at least detect misbehavior of applications. This attack is a very, very classic attack. So something is submitted to a vulnerable application and that application will misbehave. It will execute something. So with EDR, endpoint detection and response, we can very quickly determine that the post-exploitation activity is something which is out of the ordinary. And for example, with Conscia SOC, we have developed a behavior rule last weekend, which is able to immediately catch this vulnerability. So our customers were protected basically a day or two after this vulnerability has been published, if they had agents such as Palo Alto Cortex XDR Pro or Microsoft Defender for Endpoint applied on their systems which are vulnerable. So this is a very, very powerful defense. And as we will see, it prevents entire classes of attacks. The second thing, which is very important, is to take your egress filtering to the next level. So not do blacklisting, but basically say, I want to block all outgoing traffic from specific servers, except certain things which are trusted. So we have to absolutely move to whitelisting based egress filters, not blacklisting based egress filters, because then we can actually defeat most of the attackers' egress session possibilities. So those two have been suggested by us as, for example, very, very potent defenses in addition to the obvious application-based patching. So first of all, either the modification or installation of EDR/endpoint protection agents on the vulnerable endpoints, and secondly, the egress filters with specific trusted applications or trusted hosts being permitted. I would really suggest that you work based on trusted hosts, not trusted applications. Right? So those are 4 things which we feel today are the most powerful in defeating this. Let's see how you can actually put this in practice. So first of all, this is a huge issue. If you have a complex IT environment, this is big. It is complex. It is hard to tackle quickly. So we always suggest that you actually have a short time plan, which hopefully you are already implementing in the last week quite a bit, and that you have a long-term and long-tail plan, which is there to address all the things which are not high priority. So things which are unlikely to get exploited in the coming weeks. So for the short time plan, it's definitely important that you set your scope correctly. If your scope currently was your internet exposed applications or appliances, I definitely suggest that you include in your scope also systems or applications which rely or receive the data from those applications, because they can be very easily the target of relaying transitive trust attacks. The second thing is you need to discover where the vulnerability is present. So at this moment, throw everything which you have at the problem. So scanners are getting better, but in the last week, scanners were not that good. Most of the scanners were doing active verification via submission of, let's say, malicious looking code. Now scanners are getting better. You also use manual assessment. Ask your custom software vendors, look at the packages that you have. So do whatever you can to actually throw all the tools which you have at the problem to discover where this is. There's no holy grail scanner, or wasn't a holy grail scanner available in the past week. And the controls which you have available in the short term, in the panic mode, of course, patch whenever possible, if it's available. If you cannot patch, consider other methods. For example, endpoint protection, endpoint detection agents are an excellent way to prevent exploitation, because they will prevent the post-exploitation activity. They will block the application from behaving incorrectly. Additionally, you might consider using your network defenses to limit access to vulnerable hosts. For example, you can use authentication before anybody touches the host, because remember, if the host is logging an incoming connection, you're vulnerable. The moment the host logs something which is based on the action of the attacker, you're vulnerable. So you might want to consider things like SSL VPN or other VPN technologies which authenticate the user to verify that they're a trusted user before ever touching your specific system. And of course, number 4, deploy whitelisted egress filtering. So block everything from potentially vulnerable hosts or for known vulnerable hosts, and only whitelist the trusted stuff which you know is trusted. So this is kind of a recipe for the short-term mitigation, where you can basically address both things which you know are vulnerable and you can patch, things which you know are vulnerable but you cannot patch, and things which you don't know are vulnerable but are likely to be vulnerable. So you can address all of them with those 4 different controls. In the long term, we need to expand our search, of course, to the entire IT system. So definitely we need to eradicate this vulnerability as much as possible, because it is so omnipresent, and again, because it allows for remote code execution. This is no joke. So what we want to do is we want to automate this as much as possible. So in the first week, we didn't have a lot of tools. Now the tools are getting there. So for example, Tenable today has 31 different plugins available to scan for this vulnerability, from active web discovery to the discovery of library versions, file versions, and so on. And when you discover a bunch of vulnerabilities, prioritize based on how those vulnerabilities are exposed to untrusted users. Remember the transitive trust issue. So it's not only internet exposure which is important, it is also the exposure over relaying hosts. A very nice mental experiment is, for example, that you visualize how a particular piece of data travels among your applications, and at any given point it can be logged, which means that the system is vulnerable. So this kind of visualization can help you determine how deep the vulnerability can how deep the exploit can penetrate into your network. How do you control in the long term? Of course, patching is always number 1, right? Secondly, I'm a big fan of EDR, so the behavioral protection of hosts, because they can really detect or prevent misbehaving applications, and this is something which we should in the long term deploy across your enterprise to make sure that exploits like this never again catch you off guard. Whitelisted egress filtering is great, as always. If you feel that you have been compromised, this is a good time to actually do some kind of retroactive threat hunting. So it's been a week, right? Or more than a week. If you haven't been doing a lot of countermeasures, you are likely to be compromised. So deploy certain measures to see if you in the past have been compromised. And if you have certain applications which you cannot patch and you won't be able to patch, either completely isolate them, almost completely, or consider retiring them. So this is, I think, a very important lesson as well. So make sure that you don't have another, Windows 2003 situation in your network. So to sum it up, so we are a minute past time. So if you haven't been working on this for the past week, assume breach. Right? This is a very, I think, reasonable way of saying that things probably have happened in your environment. Secondly, prioritize, divide your efforts into what needs to be done now and what needs to be done in the long term, and you have different tool sets for now and later on, as I have presented. Remember the Conscia attack, right? Everybody's getting affected by this. So if you have an important partner to whom you're outsourcing a particular privileged function, if they get compromised, this compromise can very easily spill to your environment. So be aware of the third-party risk. How can Conscia help? Conscia can help in at least 3 different ways. We can actually give you the engineering or consulting help in this journey towards short-term or long-term fixing. And this includes, for example, external scanning for the vulnerability. So we can help you determine what your attack surface is. If you have been hacked or you think you might have been hacked, you can engage our incident response team. And if you're uncertain about your ability to patch systems, or if you want to have defense in depth, we are also offering emergency 24/7 monitoring, where we can deploy our managed detection and response services to your critical servers immediately. So we can do kind of an emergency MDR deployment in your environment. And of course, minimize the next panic. This will happen again. You have heard those words probably connected to not to computer security, but this kind of pandemic, right, will happen again. So this is a very good opportunity to think about what you should do to make your life easier when this happens next time. So first of all, network egress filtering. This is a very, very good chance to promote this best practice. And it is a very, very, I think, good way to deploy defenses which should protect you even if this is a day zero attacks. So for example, endpoint-based detection and response is a perfect way for detecting misbehavior of applications, which will detect entire classes of attacks like this without any updates. Okay, if you need the assistance of Conscia, here is the contact data for each country in which we operate. So feel free to contact us and we will work together on making this vulnerability go away, or at least to manage it in your environment. And in a couple of minutes we have left, I will look at the questions and answers, and I will try to answer as much as possible. And if not, then I will move to email, and I will answer you in email. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A panel. So there was a question on how the companies get infected. So today companies will get infected, as we discussed, in many different ways, through exposed servers or through transitive trust. But of course, the important part is to understand that companies will get infected through criminal gang activity. So criminal gangs have weaponized this and are actually using this on a daily basis. So everybody is an interesting target. Another question, can network behavior analysis detect this? Yes, to a certain degree it can. So if you have a network behavior analysis solution, it can detect strange patterns of communication, but it has to be really sensitive, because those are things which are not like a scanning worm or something like this. Those are things which are still quite singular events. So I wouldn't put too much trust on into network mechanisms to detect singular rare events like this, because again, by rare I mean low rate events like this. Okay, because we are kind of out of time, I will answer the rest of the questions over email. I would like to thank you very much for participating in this webinar. And if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to contact us via email on the email addresses shown. And I wish you very happy, quiet holidays, hopefully. And if you are scared, right, always definitely contact us, and we will make sure that those holidays are tranquil for everybody. Thank you very much.